The Japanese occupation of the Netherlands East Indies was a brief but incredibly important period because it set in train events that would lead to the end of the Dutch Empire in Southeast Asia and the creation of an independent nation state we know today as the Republic of Indonesia. For the Dutch, it was a bitter defeat in every sense of the word, as it signalled the end of 300 years of colonial rule over the archipelago, which had transformed the Netherlands into one of the richest nations in modern Europe. Not only did the Dutch living in the Indies have to endure a loss of status, their possessions and their livelihoods, but they also had to endure the living hell of forced internment in Japanese prison camps during the Pacific War. Of the approximate 170,000 Dutch military personnel and civilians interned in the camps, an estimated 25,000 died. And these factors, combined with the apparent willingness of Indonesian nationalist leaders to collaborate with the Japanese, meant that as far as the Dutch were concerned, Indonesian independence was nothing more than a victory made in Japan. So what propelled the Japanese to invade the Indies? In short, access to essential war supplies, especially oil. On the eve of World War II, the Dutch East Indies was the world's fifth major petroleum producer, and the US embargo on trade in vital resources with Japan meant that the capture of the Palembang oil fields in South Sumatra in the Indies, which was the largest in Southeast Asia, was a primary objective of the Japanese invasion forces in 1942. They would eventually provide Japan with 22% of its petroleum and 78% of its aviation fuel. And following the capture of Singapore in February 1942, neither the combined forces of the British and Dominion powers, nor the Dutch, could halt the rapid advance of the Japanese military machine. When the Japanese arrived in the Indies, they divided the archipelago into three sectors, with little interaction occurring between them. Java and Madura were placed under the command of the 16th Army, which was based in Jakarta. Sumatra was governed by the 25th Army, based in Singapore. And eastern Indonesia was placed under the administration of the Japanese Imperial Navy, which centred its operation in Makassar, which was the base of the Japanese Second Fleet. Significantly, the army allowed considerable latitude for Indonesian nationalists, and this included freedom of movement and contact with people, while the Navy actively discouraged any kind of political activity under its watch. This contrasting approach reinforced differences between the western and eastern halves of the archipelago. The Japanese were not just there to rule, but to create a new order based on the concept of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Introduced in 1940, the policy became the cornerstone of Japan's rationale for imperial expansion in East Asia and beyond. Perceived as a harmonious league of Asian nations led by Japan, it aimed to create a self-sufficient new order in Asia, free from European oppression. Asia for the Asians was a popular catch cry, provided it was only and always under Japanese control. However, the promises made by the Japanese seldom matched the reality. Regional economies were disrupted and infrastructure neglected, while tens of thousands of Indonesians were recruited into ramusha or forced labour ranks. Approximately 100,000 were sent abroad to work on Japanese military projects, including the notorious Thai-Burma Railway. They never returned home. Nevertheless, the Japanese did inspire a new sense of self-reliance and authority among Indonesians. For the first time, Indonesians were promoted to senior administrative and technical positions previously held by the Dutch. Bahasa Indonesia became the national language, and contacts between leaders from different political, cultural and religious groupings were encouraged. Nationalist leaders such as Sukarno and Hatta continually pressed the Japanese authorities for self-government and independence. They used the situation to their advantage by staging Japanese-approved mass rallies, which contributed to the spread of nationalist fervour and a rising level of political consciousness amongst ordinary Indonesians. The Japanese also sponsored other mass organisations, especially armed defence groups and militias. By 1945, an estimated 60,000 Indonesian nationalist youth were put through military training. These self-defence forces, such as PETA, formed the embryo of the future Indonesian Defence Forces. When the tide of war began to turn against the Japanese, the once vague promises of Indonesian cooperation in government began to take firmer shape. In September 1944, the Japanese agreed to Indonesian independence, and in March 1945, established a preparatory committee to draft a constitution for an Indonesian republic. The momentum gathered pace when Sukarno and Hatta declared Indonesian independence within 2 days of the formal Japanese surrender on the 15th of August 1945. However, the Dutch government refused to recognise the new state. To them, Sukarno was simply a Japanese collaborator, and to reinforce his point, 100,000 Dutch troops were dispatched to Indonesia in 1946 to restore order. But they faced fierce resistance from the Japanese-trained militias. Dutch forces quickly captured most cities, but could not control the countryside, and 4 years of bitter fighting ensued, punctuated by ceasefires and negotiations. World opinion slowly shifted in favour of the Republic, and the Dutch were forced to give up due to a combination of international pressure and an inability to defeat Indonesian resistance. On November 2nd, 1949, the Netherlands formally relinquished its claim over Indonesia. 1 month later, the Dutch agreed to transfer their political sovereignty over the entire territory of the former Dutch East Indies, with the exception of West New Guinea, to the Indonesian government of President Sukarno. Was it a victory made in Japan, or, in reality, a hard-won victory achieved by Indonesians for Indonesians?